The Mystery of BELICENA VILLCA. Second Book. The Letter of BELICENA VILLCA. 16th Day. About the Benedictine of Pope Gregory I, the creator of the Gregorian chant, must be added two things. One is to stand out, that the pressure exerted over Saint Leda, to influence in Recared, and achieve the massive entry of the Gellams, in Spain only brought as result that in the already existent monasteries was adopted the Regla Monachorum. And the other is to notice that his decision, taken in combination with Saint Columbanus Gallene, to send in the year 596, the monk Saint Augustine, and 39 Benedictines to Great Britain, obeyed to the necessity to replace provisionally the Irish, in the evangelizing task. Such departure carried the commitment to evangelize Angles and Saxons that not long ago had conquered the island. According to Saint Columbanus, and other Gellams, those countries, of very pure blood, manifested natural predisposition against the Celts, and specially against the Irish. Would respect only other Germans, or the Romans. They would have to realize the task, because, once evangelized, would be time for the Gellams, to infiltrate and take control in the British Church. In the year 600, the Bretwalde of Great Britain, was the King Ethelbert of Kent, whose wife, Princess of the Franks, and fervent Catholic, favors the conversion by the Romans of Saint Gregory, even though she had beside her a Frank bishop, and some priests, of her people. The success is great. The king and the population are baptized, and in Canterbury, was founded a Benedictine monastery, with hierarchy of bishopric. Then is followed by Essex, London, Rochester, York, etc. 40 years later, the Gellams would be penetrating in the Anglo-Saxon monasteries from the Celtic Scotland, supported by the King Oswald of Northumbria. Incorporated as masters in the Benedictine monasteries to the Gellams would result easier to convince the Anglo-Saxons already Christians, about the benignity of their intentions. However, for many years, the main voice will be occupied by non-Irish monks, just as the Greek Theodore of Tarsus and the Italian Hadrian. Saint Bede, the Venerable, dead in the year 735, takes the Benedictine monastery of Jarrow to its highest grade of splendor. In workshops were taught the most different occupations, religious schools, monastic farms, copy and translation of documents, musical instruction, etc. From the Anglo-Saxon Benedictine monasteries would emerge an invaluable help for the plans of the Gellams, in the person of the British missionary monks, who would be far better received than the Irish in the Germanic kingdoms. Bavaria, Thuringia, Hesse, Franconia, Friesland, Saxony, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, etc. would see passing through their lands the Anglo-Saxon monks. The major exponent of this English Benedictine current was, undoubtedly, Saint Boniface. He came from the Benedictine convent of Nursling, and his real name was Winfrid. The Benedictine Pope Gregory II gave him the new name of Boniface in the year 718, with the mission to evangelize the Germans. The truth behind all this movement was that the Gellams suspected that the Germans still conserved the Stone of Venus and other legacies of the White Atlantans, and tried to find them at any cost. For this reason Saint Boniface, for example, is determined to knock down the ancient hymn oak of the Godonwa, Engagement, in the year 722, trying to find the stone that the Germanic tradition situated in the roots of the trees. But this was not a work that the own Saint Boniface would take personally in his hands, for it he counted with thousands of Benedictine Gellams under his command. The famous Stone of Venus of the Saxons, which they finally lost, thousands of victims, attributed then cynically to the efforts of the Christianization. Saint Boniface was not then a mere preacher but a great executor of the plans of the wide fraternity. The Archgalene, hidden in the monasteries, and the Benedictine popes, will reveal him these plans in form of directives that he will faithfully fulfill. One of the most fecund acts, for these plans, for example, was the universal diffusion that impressed the idea of the superiority of the Bishop of Rome, the representative of Saint Peter, in the earth, over any ecclesiastical hierarchy or regal based in this idea, will be settled down the power of the Pope's dominion in the early Middle Ages. And the papacy, the Benedictine papacy and Gelms, it is understood, will respond giving him the archiepiscopal pallium, that will allow him to nominate his own bishops and complete the hierarchy of their priests. In the year 737, in Rome, he received from the hands of Gregory III, the highest dignity, will be papal legate in Germany, and will dispose of great powers to act. In such time, Germany included, the Frank Kingdom, the most powerful of the European Christianity. Well, the nomination of Saint Boniface had as objective to liberate his hands to carry out a plan so audacious as sinister. In the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, the Patriarch of the Church was normally submitted to the will of the Emperor. In Occident, would be necessary to reestablish the imperial power, but founded in a relation of forces completely inverse. Here, the Pope would dominate to the kings and emperors, the priest to the king, the knowledge of the cult, to the wisdom of the pure blood. And the instrument for the plan, which allowed at the same time to accomplish the plans of the wide fraternity, and the Gelms, would be the next Frank family of the Pippinids. The Merovingian kings called themselves divine, because they affirmed to descend from the liberator gods. For the Judeo-Christianity, which sustained with the Bible, identical offspring of all the mortals from Adam and Eve, such origin didn't mean nothing. The only God was the Creator God, Jehovah Satan, and no one could arrogate his lineage. And out of the Judeo-Christian Creator God, only existed the superstition of the demons. Was, then, issue of principles, to eliminate some kings who, not only declared to have divine lineage, but also affirmed to remember it with the blood. That entailment between the divinity and royalty, very popular among the Franks, was a troublesome obstacle for some priests who pretended to present themselves as the unique representatives of God in the earth. When Carlos Martel died, in the year 741, is succeeded by his sons Carloman, as mayor of Austrasia, and Pippin as mayor of Neustria. Carloman, who later would retire to the monastery of Monte Cassino, gives to Saint Boniface total liberty to reform the Frank Church, according to the Benedictine rule. The rest would be made by Pippin. In few years, through a series of synods starting from 742 to 747, the whole Frank Church is brought under the control of the Benedictine order. Carloman and Pippin are also dominated by the order. Saint Boniface communicates to Pippin the plan of the Gelms. With the approval of the new Pope Zachary, King Childeric III will be dethroned, the last of the divine Merovingian. In his place would be elected Pippin, by the greats of the empire, and his nomination would be legitimized, analogously to the Old Testament, by the consent of the Pope and the anoint of Saint Boniface. The payment of the new king, to legitimize his encroachment, would consist in a considerable booty, the creation of the Papal States. But this reward would not curtail in nothing the power of the Frank kingdom, due to, it would not be constituted at their expenses, but to Lombard and Byzantines. Indeed, the Pope demanded as payment for his alliance with the Frank king some territories that had to be previously conquered. Concerted the arrangement, in November of the year 751, the King Childeric III was confined in a Benedictine monastery, and Pippin the Short proclaimed king, and was anointed by Saint Boniface. In 754 the King Pippin and the Pope Stephen II met in the Pantheon, where they signed a treaty whereby the Franks are committed since then to protect the Catholic Church and to serve the throne of Saint Peter. Thereby, in 756, the Franks donated to Saint Peter the Exarchate, Venice, Istria, the half of the Lombard kingdom, and the counties of Spelta and Benevento. With Pippin the Short is inaugurated the Carolingian dynasty, fundamental stone in the work of the White Fraternity. In regard to what has been exposed, it is clearly perceived that the court and all the springs of the Frank state were occupied by the Benedictine order. Would not be difficult to imagine, then, in what type of ambience would be educated their grandsons and family, and what beliefs would be inculcated concerning to the old pagan religion, of the Germans, and their ancient gods. In consideration of all this, will have to be recognized to Charlie Maitland to have made all possible to become a Judeo-Christian, and to comply with the plan of the Gellams. The fruit of the centuries of patient and reserved work, obtained in the Benedictine monasteries, could be observed in the Carolingian court, especially in the denominated Palatine schools. To this school concurred the emperor personally with his sons and daughters, his personal guard, and other members of the court, when listening the lessons that were imparted by the wise Benedictines, who arrived, in many cases, from far monasteries. From Italy, came to Aachen Paul, of Pisa, Paulinus of Aquila, Paul the Deacon, etc. From Spain, came one of the lords of Tarsus, with the mission to spy the march the Gellams conspiracy, bringing at their return discouraging news about the magnitude and depth of the enemy movement, was called Tilfo of Tarsus, and was famous by his rites in the Palatine school, entitled De Spiritus Sancto Belipodens. However, even by these provenances, the majority of the masters were Irish, and Anglo-Saxon, that is, Gellams, and their henchmen. Among the last ones, is convenient to mention the head of the Palatine school, and of the general diffusion that from its part would be given to the Benedictine culture. I'm referring to Alcuin of York, disciple of the St. Bede's school, the Venerable, who entered in that Palatine school in 781, and heads between 796 and 804, date of his death, the school of the monastery of St. Martin of Tours. His Schela Palatina is the focus called Carolingian recognition, to which contributes effectively his works, of classic inspiration Neoplatonic, and based in concepts of Priscillan, Donato, Isidore, Bede, Boethius, just as De Ratione Enim, or their famous manuals that reigned, for centuries the European education, grammar, de orthographia, de rhetorica, dialectics, etc. From the Palatine school, the ideas go forth for the Epistola de Litteris Calendis, which resolutions approved by Charlie Maitland, had the force of the law and ordained the creation, in every monastery and cathedrals, of shells for priests and laymen. In these should be taught the trivium, the quadrivium, the philosophy, and theology. The trivium, and the quadrivium, formed the called 7 liberal arts. The trivium contained the grammar or philology, the rhetoric and dialectic, and the quadrivium, the astronomy, geometry, arithmetic and music. Of course, the teaching of matters was in charge on the Benedictine monks, who had prepared to it for 200 years, and were the only ones who disposed of enough masters, and classic material to comply with the real order that they had inspired. And the Benedictine Gellams had very clear how should be educated the European minds, to make possible the collective experimentation of the imperious necessity of the local temple in the coming times. So the College of Gallene constructors, that soon would be in march, would erect temples of stone, never seen before, magnificent cathedrals, constructions that would be really stone machines, offshore the Atlantean technology, and whose function would aim to transmute the mind of the believer, and to adjust it to the collective archetype of the Hebrew race, which is the same of the Jesus Christ archetype. Alcuin, who called himself Flecus, in honor to the Latin poet Horace, directed the Gallene cultural Benedictine circles, that surrounded the emperor. In those cenacles, was breathed a biblical and Judaic air very intense. The own Charlie Maitland demanded to be called David, and his loyal counselor Reinhard, for example, asked to be named Bissel, by the constructor of the tabernacle of the Temple of Jerusalem. And this special microclimate ambiented, by the Benedictine Gellams, the emperor and his main collaborators of the Frank nobility, were gradually brainwashed and conditioned to adopt the Gallene perspective, about the order of the world. To preserve this order, for example, had to be eradicated paganism, and imposed Judeo-Christianity, on the whole world. That was the good, what demanded the law of God, and what subscribed the representative of St. Peter. It didn't matter if to achieve that good, had to be destroyed brother populations. God would forgive his followers all what was made in his name. The Gellams, conditioned in this way the mind of the emperor, because they needed a new Proceus, a hero, to execute the extermination sentence that was over the population of pure blood of the Saxons, and would allow them to steal the stone of Venus. At least, the Proceus population of the Carthaginians, that destroyed Tartessos 1,000 years before, belonged to other race. The crime of Charlemagne and his Franks is inestimably greater, because, not conformed with the military support in the offensive ordained by Saint Boniface against the Hyperborean wisdom of the Saxons, he undertook the work to exterminate the Saxon nobility in person, close brother of the Frank blood. The Saxon population was one of the last in Occident who maintained uninterruptedly loyal to the pact of blood and the liberator gods. According to what they believed, the White Atlantans had entrusted them the mission to protect the great secret of the white race that from the sky fell over Germany thousands of years ago during the Battle of the Atlantis. Such secret was specifically mentioned in the myth of Naten, to whom the Saxons called Wetten, as the ring of the Chalcidic key, where the traitor gods had engraved the sign of the origin. Freer Partridge had to release it before entering in the moribund Naten, and his fall. According to the wisdom of the Saxons, it occurred in Germany. Specifically, had fell over the rocks of the Sternsteiner, a mountain located in the middle of the forest Teutoburg walled. The Saxons believed sustained that the ring touched the rock at the same time in which Naten resuscitated and acquired the wisdom of the language of the birds. This produced that the sign of the origin be decomposed in the 13+3 runes, or runes, and these were impressed in the rocks of the Sternsteiner forever. Over one of them, the most prominent, anyone with spiritual lineage will be able to see, for example, the most sacred rune of the White Atlantans, the one that represents the great chief, Evton, that is, the Odal rune. But the Saxons not only knew, in that late date of the 8th century before Christ, the runes of Naten, but they had achieved to preserve, just as the lords of Tharsis, their stone of Venus. In the peak, the Christosteiner was erected, since immemorial times the Universalis Columna, Ermingsel, a wood pillar that represented the Tree of Terror, where Naten had crucified himself, to know the secret of the death. This sanctuary was venerated by the Germans, since ancient times, and, to avoid its profanation by the Romans in the year 9, before Christ, the Tricerat chieftain, Arminius, or Hermann, annihilated the army of the general Publius Quinctilius Verus, composed by 20,000 legionaries, in the proximities of Teutoburg. Verus, and the main officials committed suicide after the disaster. The heroic Saxons would not have the same luck 700 years after in front of an enemy, overwhelmingly superior, and who manifested to them an irrational intolerance similar to the one that Hamilcar experimented against the Tartessians. Of course, that, behind that intolerance of Charlemagne, must be seen, as in the case of Hamilcar, the hand of the Gellams, the necessity, artificially implanted in the mind of those generals, to comply with the extermination sentence. The sin of the Saxons was this: they occupied the forest and were committed to realize their mission with such effort that impeded for centuries the Gellams to get closer to the Christosteiner. But the worst was that they engraved 13+3 runic signs of the sacred alphabet in the Ermingsel's column, and they embedded on its center the stone of Venus, in remembrance of the unique eye of Wetten, that looked to the world of the deceit from the Tree of Terror. The repulsion that the Saxons experienced, for the Gallene priests, their irreversible rejection to Judeo-Christianity, their loyalty to pact of blood or to the Hyperborean wisdom, their furious defense of the area of Teutoburg walled, and their denial to give the stone of Venus, were enough motives to ordain the extermination of the Saxons' royal house, especially in that moment, when the power of the Gelms was in its apogee. Only this explains the bloodthirsty persistence of Charlemagne, who for 30 years fought, without truce against the Saxons, cultural population and military inferior to the Franks, and if it resisted, was due to the indomitable courage that the spirit made sprout of their pure blood. In the year 772, the troops of the new Prussians fell on the Teutoburg Wall and, after a fierce struggle, achieved to take the Xlesteiner, and to give it to the Benedictine Gallium priests for its purification. They didn't delay to destroy the Irminsul column, and to steal the Stone of Venus, condemning since then the Saxons, from the darkness of the strategic confusion, to the disorientation about the origin. However, even if they conquered the booty, was missing to comply with the sentence of the Galliums. In the 783, invading, Charlemagne, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, would make decapitate 5,000 noble Saxons, whose pure blood would consume and the ritual sacrifice the unity of the Creator God Jehovah Satan. After a posterior existence without hopes, by the only surviving rebel chief, Wittikind, the Saxons finished accepting the Judeo-Christianity, as many other populations in similar circumstances, and integrated in the Frank kingdom. Charlemagne died in Aachen, in the year 814, but in 800, he had already received from the Pope Leo III, the consecration as Roman Emperor, fair payment for whom has served so much for the Church, and for the cause of the Benedictine order. He was succeeded as emperor by his son, Louis the Pious, to whom his contemporaries nicknamed the Pious, and the Monk, for his dedication to the Church, and his preoccupation to put the Frank monks definitively under the power of the Benedictine order. Just 3 years after his imperial coronation, he fulfilled the Diet of the Galliums, in the Synod of Aachen of 817, whereas agreed to impose the Benedictine rule in all the monasteries of the Frank dominions, that is, to what prompt would be the Roman Empire of the German nation. Part of Spain, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Friesland, Italy, etc. With the sanction of such imperial law, the power of the order was consolidated enough as to make that the Galliums could not think in other thing, for the next 270 years, than to take to the perfection the College of Constructors of Temples. In the precedent 200 years, they accumulated the knowledge of the science. Now they would pass to the practice. They would form guilds of constructees, composed by the learner lodges, mason schoolfellows, and masters. And such lodges would be laic, integrated by common people, but directed in secrecy by the order, that will be the keepers of the plan and the codes of the temple. Also would miss to dispose of a final key, a secret that would allow the Galliums to take their work to its major perfection. But the Galliums, and through them, the Benedictine order, counted with the word of the wide fraternity, that such secret would be entrusted to them when their European mission would be almost accomplished. Such secret, such key of the keys, consisted in the tablet of the law of Jehovah Satan, the ones that the Creator God gave to Moses in the Mount Sinai, and that made possible for Hiram, king of Tyre, the construction of the Temple of Solomon, the Temple of the Temples. That were engraved, through a sacred alphabet of 22 signs, the secret of the serpent, that is to say, the highest knowledge, that is permitted to be reached by the animal man, the words that the God One employed, to name all the things of the creation. With those tablets in his power, the Galliums would be in conditions to erect a Temple of Solomon in Europe, complying in this way with the plans of the wide fraternity, and elevating the chosen people to the throne of the world. Naturally, before reaching to such wonderful realizations, the Benedictine order would have to resolve many problems. In addition, to start of the College of Temple Constructors, would be necessary to create the conditions to make that the populations of the Roman Empire support the existence of a military order within the pale of Catholic Church. Such order would have a double function. In one hand, to guard for the moment in which the wide fraternity would decide to give it to the Galliums, the tablets of the law, from their actual location in Jerusalem to Europe. And on the other hand, to serve as a support in the military force in the constitution of the financial synarchy, or concentration of the economic power, that would be necessary to establish in Europe, as previous step to the world government of the chosen people.